Happy 2025 to everybody out there in the Western calendar, the Western Hemisphere, and the world. And as so much of my show, I've been guided by the spirits, those who have walked the path with me, those who have come before me, those who have made the ultimate sacrifice and given light and love to the world unconditionally, without really any kind of expectation, and finding the most beautiful forbidden fruit along the way. And for me, I have reached inside my record collection and pulled out so many different master instrumentalists and singers and band leaders. And again, this happened recently on a trip to a bookstore here in Tucson where I found this record. Then I knew immediately that it was going to be a spiritual reckoning because rhythm has been the most healing force for me in my more recent life, becoming a father and just sort of, traversing the landscape of all the Western dogma around. It's amazing when you're inside that cocoon of live polyrhythmic music, the descarga that occurs, the healing that occurs for this host. And I get a chance today to speak to somebody who knows all about that because he's been doing it. The album was Not Alone, which was a full rhythm composition album, double album. And I've been talking to my drummer friends here in Tucson and telling them that they should consider doing an album, their own rhythm album, because it takes you away from the thinking mind and brings you into the spirit mind. And my guest has many more accomplishments than just that record. But let's be clear, he is a healer and he is a profound thinker, and he's somebody that I look forward to learning from. Alex Cline, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you for your very kind and humbling words.
It's true, man. I just wanted to start by asking you, I'm just going to take a chance here. I know your brother and you were born in Los Angeles, but at that time, when did you connect with Bobby Bradford and John Carter and maybe Horace Tapscott? Because like that vein of jazz, that spirit is so righteous. And I noticed you collaborated with him. I just wanted you to take us through how you wound up in that pocket of music.
Okay. I guess I'll just start by saying that Nelson and I got into playing music as young rock kids. So by the time we were 11 and 12, he had taken up the electric guitar and I had taken up the drums. And it wasn't until my teen years that I discovered the jazz world in its more adventurous and daring forms. And that was largely made possible by my huge fandom as a youngster of the music of Frank Zappa and Captain Beefheart.
I dig.
So Nelson and I discovered that jazz actually, there was a lot of jazz that didn't sound anything like what our typical kind of, West Side LA white guy idea of it was. Which, you have that cartoon image of what a jazz musician is and what jazz sounds like. And it was the experience of hearing John Coltrane for the first time. There's a whole story of how that happened, but I'll just
Oh, please riff on that. I mean, Train is right in our zeitgeist, so go right
okay.
ahead.
What happened was we had a close friend in junior high school named David Hirschman, and his father was a celebrated poet named Jack Hirschman.
Wow.
Maybe you've
Wow.
heard of him. And his mother was at the time the program director at radio station KPFK, which was a Pacifica nonprofit public radio station here in LA, still exists. And one of the things that David discovered his father wanted for a present was some John Coltrane records. So he bought his dad what had just come out, which was the compilation, the double album, John Coltrane, His Greatest Years. And as David heard this being played, he thought, because of what he knew about my taste in music, that I might find it interesting and maybe I dig it. And that was because of David's take on the music I listened to as being, quote, noisy, you know. So he was
Noisy, real noisy. Okay.
noisy, yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
So I think he was referring specifically to the later tracks that have Pharaoh on them and such. And he was thinking, wow, Alex might like this. And so he loaned Nelson me this record, and we put on the first track, which was an edit of Africa, and it
Right.
completely blew our minds. The closest experience I could compare it to is when Nelson and I first heard Jimi Hendrix, which was so totally mind blowing and influential that it was almost like hearing music for the first time. So, hearing Coltrane's sound and hearing the context and the modality of it, it was just like a massive discovery that led to all kinds of other exploration into that musical world. So by the time I was in high school, I had pretty much given myself almost completely over to pursuing that kind of music, which included Miles Davis and all his various sidemen over the years, and all the Coltrane sidemen. So I will share that a hugely influential experience I had while I was in high school, which was a very dark time for me otherwise. I
Hmm.
felt very alienated and depressed and very pessimistic and um, cynical about life at that time. I mean, no one had explained to me that when puberty really fully hit, that it was going to completely change my brain chemistry. But
Oh my gosh.
it
Yeah.
was a
Feeling.
really, really difficult time for me. And one of the things that I have to say in total honesty is that the thing that probably ultimately really saved me was this music. And
This is the most. This is making my day, man. Thank you.
okay.
Yeah.
And the fact that so many of the musicians and the music that I was experiencing at that point was directly and demonstrably spiritually oriented. So what this influential experience that I'm alluding to was my electing to go to a concert by myself because no one was willing to go with me at the time at Royce Hall at UCLA, and this was probably in about 1972 or three, to see a double bill of Pharoah Sanders and the Michael White Quartet.
Damn.
Yeah, and
Michael was one of I rest in peace. One of my first interviews. The Fourth Way, man. That dude is
okay,
out of his mind. Yeah.
loved that stuff. So, so I got a single seat in what turned out to be second row center in Royce Hall, and I, to make a long story short, had this experience that was I will put in the grand category of spiritual. It's like a spiritual awakening, like I'd experienced something that I'd only thought I knew about in theory or that others had talked about, but I felt like as I was walking out of the auditorium that I had had a genuine spiritual experience that frankly contributed to just changing my life. There are a lot of details about that
Well,
experience,
no,
but
I want to be clear about this. Is almost a baptism of sorts. If that may be the I don't know if that's the right word, but I mean, can you talk about the multi-dimensional component of that experience?
okay, sure. This was the time when Pharaoh had a group with, a large group that had Joe Bonner on piano
Hmm.
and Jimmy Hops on drums,
Oh,
Lawrence Killian on percussion. And the music, the dynamics of the music ranged from droning, meditative, quiet to absolutely intense, screaming. Pharaoh literally screaming and pounding his chest, and taking the audience, the listener, on this huge adventure, this huge kind of panoramic experience nonstop. And at the end of this experience, to give you an idea, Pharaoh had a bell not unlike this, but larger. And I'm holding a temple bell for those who are listening. And was inviting the bell with a big mallet. So it was what looked like to me a Burmese, possibly temple bell. So
Mhm.
he's inviting it, and as the band is quieting down, quieting down, quieting down, leaving just Pharaoh and this bell. And when he stopped inviting the bell, he was holding it up. His eyes were closed. He was looking down, and he remained in that space in what was a profoundly noticeably total silence for minutes. And this, I'm not exaggerating. I actually kind of sort of came out of this reverie that I was in and started to wonder what was going on. And so I remember I started to look around. I looked to my right and I saw people sitting in their seats. I looked to my left. I saw people sitting in their seats. I saw the heads of the people in the row in front of me. And I became aware of the fact that, there's an entire auditorium of people behind me, but no one's making any sound at all. It was absolutely silent. And it was almost, I mean, it was unsettling in the best sort of way. And after a while, Pharaoh lowered the bell and looked up at the audience, and then there was just this massive ovation from the audience. And that, I mean, I've never experienced anything like that before or since, that, and combined with how moved I was and inspired I was by Michael White's quartet and their set beforehand. It was just a profound experience. So I had already been investigating this music, the so-called avant-garde, for example, and a lot
Sure.
of ACM artists, and also some people who were playing more innovative and adventurous music from Europe. And you know how it is, but one thing leads to another, and pretty soon your record collection's getting bigger and bigger. And
Were you
Nelson,
getting off on the Wolfgang Downer stuff on MPS?
not, I don't remember being into that so much, but I was particularly checking out some of the drummer percussionists because I was being given over to adding different sounds to my
Sure, sure.
vocabulary. So I became really influenced by people like there was a British percussionist named Frank Perry,
Yes.
became big for me, and Pierre Favre from Switzerland, Tony Oxley, Han Benink, people like that.
Love this. Yeah.
Yeah, but the
The record collection started to get very big.
yeah, so
Yeah.
it's and Nelson and I started going to concerts, and we would go quite frequently to the Lighthouse in Hermosa Beach, which featured a lot of the artists that we were now listening to, and was a venue that we as underage people could actually attend legally. So a lot of really important music, but I guess the point here is that the fact that there was music by people like Pharaoh, by Coltrane, by some of the AACM people, by John McLaughlin, by people who were basically um, exploring the spiritual dimension of life and having it reflected in their music, this started to have an impact on me, a formerly totally um, materialistic, cynical, and at that point depressed, young person growing up in Los Angeles. And, in some ways that was really confusing. And in other ways, it proved to be so inspiring and sustaining that, as I said earlier, it pretty much changed my whole perspective on life as I knew it at the time. Um,
I
so
wanted
that's how I got into all that, I
to,
guess.
I mean, I want to go back. It's just so funny that you brought up Zappa originally,
Mm-hmm.
because I just done a segment of interviews with Chester Thompson, who was his
Oh,
drummer
yeah.
for a period of time.
Right.
And he was steeped in R&B and B and soul with organ trios before that. Obviously, George Duke was playing simultaneously with Zappa, with
Mm-hmm.
Cannonball, with Roy McCurdy, who was out of his mind with Airto and Buck
Oh,
Clark.
yeah.
And
Incredible.
I wanted you to talk about specifically when your brother you guys heard Hendrix, you're
Mm-hmm.
hearing Coltrane. I guess it was a double album on Impulse, maybe. I don't
Yes.
know. Yeah,
Right.
okay. Okay,
Yeah.
this idea of going from this earthbound state of intellectualizing the music
Mm-hmm.
to raising your frequency into the intergalactic. I mean, this is what my whole show is about, whether it's conversing or whether it's and the reason I say that is because that requires focus and discipline
Mm-hmm.
and also healing. And I just wanted you to talk about, because you were in a depressed state. And I believe me, my older daughter is in a psychically painful state right now. She's not overly materialistic, but when you just said that before, she's in her first year at Princeton. She's confused, she's struggling, and I pray that she can find some kind of cathartic spiritual outlet, authentic like you did. So I think it's
Uh,
really beautiful. But I wanted you to talk about how your frequency raised from being plugged into guys that were operating from the intergalactic.
yeah, that's a really interesting and perhaps challenging question.
Hey, riff any way you want.
Okay, well, one of the things I'll say that kind of is a factor here is that both Nelson and I, for some reason that's impossible to really adequately explain,
Yeah.
um, had interest and enjoyment in um, uh, what could be considered unusual or weird, as people would usually say, music from the beginning. So even though my brother, for example, was heavily influenced in the beginning of his music listening days by, say, the Byrds, um, we really gravitated towards music that had a lot of innovation and sort of adventurous exploration into the world of sound and just sonic interest. So, what at the time would have been termed psychedelic music. And that just kind of continued. So, we were just attracted to music that had a lot of focus on just the sound of it.
Right.
The content of the lyrics and all that kind of stuff was way secondary for both of us.
Me
So,
too, man. I love this.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so, another experience that I want to bring up here is one of the things that really helped me come out of this kind of dark state that I was in high school was during our senior year, two students came to our high school, which was called University High School in West LA, from Locke High School, which was in Watts. And they came for their senior year because they, quote, wanted to learn something before they graduated because their school was basically kind of like a war zone. And one of them was a guitarist and the other was a drummer. And they both played in the award winning Locke High jazz band, which, by the way, is the band that spawned Patrice Rushen, for
Oh
example.
man.
So, and a host of others, including Ricky Washington, the father of Kamasi Washington. So um, Glenn Jeffrey was the guitarist, and Shasta Harville was the drummer. And they were listening to the same music that we were, which was in itself a huge thing. But they also knew all these musicians who were playing in what people would refer to now as South Los Angeles. And one of the people they knew well, whom they would tell us amazing stories about, was a local drummer who went by the name of Sonship. So Woody
That's why we connected. I just want to stop you right there because going back to when I started my show in 2011, one of my first guests was the skipper Henry Franklin.
Oh yeah.
All right, and Sonship, these Woody
Mm-hmm.
Shaw albums that Sonship's playing on, and then
Yeah.
it goes to Roberto Miranda, who says that during the gigs, Sonship's getting up, beating his chest off the drums, praying to God.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a whole tribute show one day, like 10, 12 years ago. He passed 4 months before I started my program. Sonship is deeply embedded. I cannot believe. I'm not surprised. I just
Okay.
so they knew they were seeing Sonship live.
Right.
Wow.
So here's the deal.
Yeah.
So a friend of ours in high school, Michael Preussner, who later became the first drummer in my brother's trio, um, who was one of the only people we knew at the time who was listening to this music as well, told us that Henry Franklin's band was playing at what was then called the Pilgrimage Theater, which is now the John Anson Ford Amphitheater.
Wow.
One of the free concerts put on by the Musicians Union, Local 47, and that Ndugu Chancellor was going to be the drummer, whom Michael had heard with Alice Coltrane and thought was really good. So he thought we should go. And so we were like, cool, let's go. So we went, and as it turned out, Ndugu was not playing, Sonship was playing. And so here was this guy that we had heard so much about, these, fairly amazingly phenomenal, weird stories. And this is another one of these things that's hard to explain. But Henry, thank goodness, always just let Sonship have his way with the music. He just like let him do whatever he wanted to do, gave him full reign. And the concert started with Sonship playing a solo. So Sonship had a microphone and he recited some kind of cosmic poem. I can't remember what. And then pushed the mic away and then just started in on this completely insane solo.
Oh my God.
And
Oh my God.
that was another one of those moments for me. I have to tell you that I felt like all the cells in my body just lit up. So it was really profound. So the net result of this was I became kind of this like um, shy and sort of reticent acolyte of Sonship Theus.
Oh, this is
Um,
on. I
and
cannot. This is so because I have spent time. I've slept over at Skipper's house in
oh wow,
Riverside, and the pictures. I mean, Sonship. I'm telling you, Woody Shaw freaked out. I mean, I don't know if I just have to tell this quick story because you're making my day. But
okay,
there's an album that actually has never been reissued and um, called Song of Songs,
yeah, I have it. Yeah,
contemporary. Yeah. So Cables and what and the flute player, they were in Blakey's band. Woody Shaw was too. So Blakey was on tour in LA. They came in and Emmanuel Boyd was the flute player. So they
right,
went, Woody's like, hey, let's make an album. So they wanted to use a different rhythm section. Ramon Morris was also in Blakey's band. So they brought in Skip, and they needed a drummer. So they brought in one drummer, and Woody's like, nah, it's not going to work. So the next day, Skip calls Sonship, no answer. They bring in another drummer. Woody's not happy with that drummer. Skip goes home. They called Sonship again. This time, Sonship picks up. Turns out he had been meditating for 4 days, was not near his phone. It says, "Hey, listen, come into the studio tomorrow. I'm doing an album with Woody." And they had never met. And Woody walks into the studio, and Sonship had, as you know, strobe lights and
Yes.
skeleton bones and flat. I mean, the whole. And Woody's like, "What the heck is this?" And I'll tell you, the minute they played with that album
Mm.
was a searing jolt. I mean, for somebody who was born in 1978, I mean, the fact that you were a witness in real time to this stuff is beyond. Because that was those were the last remnants, Pharaoh, Sonship. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm not saying music died after that, but there was something. I mean, pre-drum. I mean, drum machine. Maybe Sly was using one in the early '70s, but it was human spiritual rhythm, and you saw it firsthand. And that's it. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is interesting because at that concert, here it is. It's outdoors in the afternoon, and Sunship still had, a black light on his bass drum head that that said he had one of his depictions on it had a hole cut in the center with a styrofoam ball representing the earth that would like move in and out as he played. And it's the message on his bass drum head was, "You are a creator."
Oh, man, this is. And
Yeah.
I love that
So
Skip let him be himself too. Like Skip
totally.
let him go free, man.
Yeah. So, listening to this is, with its Sunship still playing his old Gretsch paint splattered drum set and with the upside down cymbals and, all of that stuff. Um, and so whenever I would get wind of where he was playing with anybody, I would go. And
Wow.
sometimes I would help him uh, carry his gear out of his big gold Buick Electra that he was driving then, and help him schlep his gear back into it after the gig. And we wouldn't exchange too many words because I was just kind of too shy and in awe. But I had actually gone to his place. He lived behind his parents' house in Watts, and was just I mean, this was just a huge, another huge awakening for me. At the time, he was playing in Charles Lloyd's band,
Sure.
which had at that time Blackbird McKnight on guitar and a guy Celestial Songhouse, aka Sherman McKinley, on bass guitar. And we saw that group once, and that was kind of the context in which one could have the full Sonship experience because Lloyd, same deal. He just let him take the music wherever he wanted, including vocalizing through an echoplex, and he had the strobe light and the black lights and the whole thing. That was basically a psychedelic band.
It was completely psyched. I mean, I cannot believe how your brain was split up. You were telling me, I mean, I just am curious. This is so classic. The contingent of cats that was hip to this was
Mhm.
like I counted on one hand, or how many like you were in this cocoon of enlightenment. It was quite remarkable, man.
Yeah, we
And
were
yet
so lucky.
also and yet also like the idea that here is somebody who is a force of nature living behind his parents' house.
Yeah, yeah.
There is no material there. What is the definite? All of a sudden, the whole idea of definitions of success and self-worth and ability to inspire. I mean, you must have been like, there are other ways to be
Mm.
a light in this world.
Yeah. Well, we were super lucky, and oddly enough, our status as young, somewhat naive white guys from the West Side in some ways made us privileged because we had the ability to entertain this as a possibility, because we also had parents, both of whom were school teachers, both of whom were older when they had us. My mom had us when she was 40, and that was it. We were twins, two for one. Um, and
No, I mean, it was worth the wait.
And we were really lucky because they actually already knew who they were as people. They weren't still really growing up,
Hmm.
and they were actually very supportive of our wacky interests. I mean, I was a visual art kid until I was around 11 when I started playing the drums, and then it was a simultaneous thing from that point on until music took over by the time I was college age. In fact, there's a story for you because I
Please.
couldn't decide what direction I was going to go in. So I took a break from school, and within 3 months, I had recorded 3 albums and done a European tour with Julius Hemphill's trio. So,
Wow. I see. I no.
at,
I need. How the heck did you connect with him?
okay, well, and I was 21 at the time, and that kind of that changed things rather permanently.
Before we go on, I just wanted to go back. Were you? It just sounds to me because the first question I had, and this is the way these interviews go, is that they're circular and they come back.
Sure.
But there was this. You had. I mean, clearly in the early '70s, you're still seeing Michael White, Pharoah at Royce Hall,
Hmm.
all out of the Masters, Dizzy and Freddie and all those cats, Miles, they were still cooking, making up music, making up new vocabulary.
Yeah.
And then you had like Dante's or your Frank Strazzeri and all these
Oh,
West
yeah.
Coast hard bop guys. But then you
Right.
have this Pan-African stuff, this Horace Tapscott, this Bobby Bradford. I'm just, I guess, real
Oh,
succinctly,
yeah.
were you when you were like adjacent to the Sonship and Charles Lloyd stuff? Were you
Hmm.
also hip to that scene, that niche of Tapscott and those cats?
Yes. That's the short answer.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. Yeah, that's
But
amazing.
I no,
Yeah,
let me expand on that a bit because you asked about that earlier, and I forgot to go back to that.
it's all right.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we discovered as we were exploring this music was the people who were in our area who were doing it. So um, one of the things that has been something I've been profoundly grateful for many years is that when I started embarking on actually playing that music, um, that was when I met Bobby and John and Horace,
Wow.
and
Wow.
they were all just just kind of almost shockingly supportive of our interest and our early um, just efforts in trying to play that music. So related to this, at the time, by 1976 and 77, I was playing in a duo with a saxophonist named Jamil Shabaka. And I don't know if you're familiar with it. The first album I
I,
ever,
I saw it. I've never seen it. I'm desperate to hear
okay,
it.
that
Yeah.
was the first album that I ever did,
Right.
duo called Duo Infinity, um, with uh, with Jamil, who later became Jamael and started playing drums instead of saxophone, but that was much later. Um, and through our playing local gigs and things, that was one of the ways we came in contact with people like John and Bobby. And Jamil had played in Horace's orchestra, so there was a real connection there. And also the bass guitarist who played in the group that Nelson and I started after we graduated high school, a group called Ring, was a guy named Steve Conley who lived in what people refer to as the Crenshaw district and who had a twin brother who was a saxophonist named Al Conley, who was also someone who went through the Horace's program with the orchestra. So we had heard a lot about Horace, and I don't remember when I finally met Horace, but I did wind up playing with Horace, which was the first time in 1980. In fact, there's an album that's supposed to someday be released of that concert.
Don't even tease me right now.
Oh, yeah. Here's the teaser. So it's a
Oh my God. Are you
trio with
kidding
me
me?
and Roberto Miranda at live at the Century City Playhouse from 1980, a double album or a CD. I think they keep vacillating as to be able to do with it. But actually,
Unbelievable. I want to
I
ask you
love
something.
that.
Wait, I want to. This is
Yeah.
important. When you these cats, um, much to your surprise, or whatever, they were loving the fact that you were curious about this music, but it was you didn't necessarily expect that kind of reaction because you were maybe these not elite, but West LA white kids who and they just were they just they were just maybe honored that you were
Wow. Huh.
searching.
Yeah, I guess yes, but I mean there are two things
Yeah.
going on here. One is that, you know, once I really got into this music, of course, I felt like a certain inferiority complex
Right.
being like this, young white kid from LA. I mean, plus the fact you've probably seen pictures of what I looked like. I looked like this, hippie surfer kid.
No, you look like a disciple, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
I dig. I mean, I cannot imagine how like an aspiring, innovative person is like, okay, now I'm in this in the land of giants. How do
yeah,
I even feel
right.
adequate? Yeah.
Yeah. So, but on the other hand, when I think back on it, I also had some kind of a weird um, acknowledgement of my own possibilities and capabilities.
Love
So I
it.
wasn't totally insecure, but certainly the encouragement from these people was tremendous, right? So it
That,
doesn't
no,
matter.
this is really this is so important because I need you to talk about this.
Okay.
So many, and I just talked about this with or I just transcribed this thing because the African form of communication on the bandstand
Mm,
was not all normally was not we are very verbal in Western society. And a lot of times those guys, and you tell me how they did it for you when they supported you or encouraged you. There were times where maybe if you were playing with them, if you didn't get it, it wasn't like they would throw shade at you or be disrespectful,
mm,
but just sort of through nonverbal communication, you'd know you didn't get it. Okay. But it was a certain type of communication that is not from the West. You dig
uh,
that?
yeah. Well, yeah.
It wasn't
Yeah,
verbal. It wasn't talking. It was like,
right.
you know what I'm saying? Like
Absolutely.
there was this thing where it's like, it wasn't, no, that's not what it is. But they didn't browbeat you. They didn't try to intellectualize it. It's just more
Right.
effort. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I never thought of it that way, but yeah, I can tell you my experience was
sure.
was very much like what you're describing. So to give you an example, the other thing I was going to say is, I mean, there were people who were suspicious and not supportive from that world,
Right.
but not very many. I mean, there were,
There's always some outliers. Yeah.
and when they weren't, I was just like, yeah, I understand, I can dig that. It's not, it's
I'm
not.
not taking it personally. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going to, but it's not going to deter me.
Right.
So
Exactly.
to give
Exactly.
you to give you an idea, two things come to mind. John Carter, for example, sometimes he would just call on the phone. Now, I was still living at home. Also, because I lost a ton of money on doing this tour with Julius Hemphill, so that's a whole other
Well, we
story.
have to get into that later. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to hear that. But yeah, it wasn't a
Yeah,
fruitful. Yeah.
but consequently, I was still living at home,
Sure. Sure.
and I was like 22 years old at the time, and John would just call on the phone, and he'd say, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I was just practicing." He said he would say, "So could I come over and we could just do some playing?" And I'd say, "Absolutely, sure, come on over." And this was in the afternoon. He would drive over in his vintage Porsche SC coupe, and step out of the car and come in through the house and pull out his clarinet. And then we would just go nuts for, until we were done. And, what an incredible experience that was, another thing that occurs to me, and this involves bringing up someone that I had intended to mention earlier. Um, we had a high school friend named Lee Kaplan who became the person who started organizing the regular concerts at the Century City Playhouse because he, through me, dare I say it, got into this music at the time. And he eventually got an NEA grant to put on these concerts. And that's became one of the places for this music in the whole Los Angeles area for a while. And he was very unlike me, who was so hesitant and self-conscious about this stuff, and to this day is terrible at self-promotion. Um, he would just talk me up to some of these guys,
Right.
and that's how I met Julius. So Julius was coming through town with Bakita Carroll to do some trio music, and he apparently asked Lee, do you know of any drummers in the area? We want to play this music, and if you have any suggestions. So Lee immediately, I guess, said, "Yeah, you got to play with this guy, Alex Cline." So this was in the fall of 1977. I was 21. Here came these two guys who had just played up in the Bay Area, and they come into that back room where Nelson and I had all our stuff, and we started just playing. And I remember Julius, who was exactly the kind of person you were describing. He wouldn't give a lot of verbal feedback about anything. He, we stopped playing, and he stood there, kind of nodding. And remember, Julius with that mellifluous kind of bass voice.
Right.
At the time, had a shaved head and earrings, and had you cut the 6'4", cut this hugely imposing figure. Looks at me with this kind of smile on his face and says, "Yeah, sounding pretty potent there." And and we played this gig at the Century City Playhouse, and that led to playing 3 nights up in the Bay Area, and that led to him inviting me to do this European tour.
Did you play at Keystone Corner? Where would you play?
We played at a place called Mapenzi.
I am not hip to that place.
Yeah, Mapenzi was owned by African American jazz fans, basically. Um, it was right on the border of Oakland and Berkeley,
Dag.
and it was like the whole place was kind of like a work of art inside. It had
Oh,
all
this is
kinds of mosaics
unbelievable.
and tile, and was quite extraordinary. And had a bar in one room, and then the concert space in the other. Numbers of people came and sat in with us. In fact, in the compilation of Julius's uh, excerpts from the Julius Hemphill archive at NYU, there's a live track from one of those gigs in that the 7 CD set. um,
Are you kidding me? And so like Dewey Redman and Hadley Caliman would come in. I mean, who was coming in
no,
there?
it was not no big names like that.
Just
Speaking,
cats would come in and yeah, yeah.
yeah, but speaking of Hadley Kalman,
Oh my God, another spirit in my soul, man.
I have to assume you're hip to the album Iapetus with Sonship
Very
Woody.
Sonship. That's Sonship right there.
Right.
Yeah, I
So
know that album. I'm very. I mean, I'm at. Yeah, absolutely.
right.
I
But
ate it. Yeah,
anyway,
well, talk to me about. Was that a seminal album for you?
Iapetus.
Yeah.
Oh well, anything that had Sonship on it was seminal for me at the time.
Oh my
So
God, this is so
there was so
incredible.
little there was so little available in recorded form of really of Sonship at his peak, unfortunately. So, I heard him play on a level that's way beyond anything that he.
Oh my God. I mean, I cannot even imagine live shit
Yeah,
because that. I mean, Tribal Dance, Henry Franklin,
yeah, yeah,
Gita Land was Charles Lloyd,
yeah. Gita,
Iapetus, and then And then he actually wound up playing double drums on a Harold Land album called Coma.
Yes, right,
Yeah, something like that. Anyway,
right.
it was sparse. Yes, very
And
sparse.
Bobby Hutcherson's
That's right.
yeah.
You were at the most magical apex of. So at that time with Hemphill and those
Mhm.
shows, can you just talk about your spiritual path at that point? I mean, I read, it's funny, I just opened up the gatefold this morning of Not Alone.
Yeah.
And like you recommended, you said read this after you listen to the music.
Oh yeah.
And
Mm.
you talk very eloquently about the songs, the meanings of the songs, the spiritual meanings behind the songs, some of the
Mm.
references to different
Yeah.
figures in our spiritual world. And I never, I sort of assumed either being that your parents were teachers, probably fairly open-minded. It wasn't a very overly dogmatic household. I just wonder spiritually if where you were at, especially once you started to actually make spiritual music on the bandstand with
Uh,
masters of this music.
yeah. Okay. A couple of things. One is that the the so-called religious context in our house growing up was
Yes,
basically non-existent. But on the other hand, secular humanism was very strong, and in and of itself can be almost like a
absolutely.
religion.
That was the same way I was raised. Yeah,
Yeah, complete with guilt and a certain dogmatism,
that's right.
but still, by the time I was playing with Julius, yeah, I was actually in this kind of eclectic and unspecific sort of spiritual focus, um, inspired by everything that we've been talking about. But by the time I made Not Alone, I was more specifically focused, but in a way that I am now, many years later, not focused. So I will say that the liner notes, which in some ways I regret because sometimes I think people can just say way too much, were very much influenced by my uh, connection with Frank Perry, whom I mentioned earlier, who was very given over to a kind of long, exhaustive, in-depth, and verbose verbal accounts of his music making, and also by the notes supplied by the French composer Olivier Messiaen, who was
Hmm.
also a big influence on me. Um,
Hmm.
Hearing his music for the first time, which was played by the quartet called Tashi, their rendition of his piece Quartet for the End of Time, was another one of those big kind of spiritual moments for me.
Although then there was that cat, Nathan, was it Bud? Last name Bud, Budd.
Yeah,
There was a
Harold Budd.
Yeah. I mean, again, this all goes into the Harry Parch bag and the
Yeah,
I mean,
I loved all that.
you were right there, man. I mean, it's like right. But
Yeah,
anyway, I also want to be clear.
yeah.
You might be your own worst critic in terms of where you're at today versus the
Okay.
evolution. But you know what?
Mm,
You used the word potency today with Hemphill, and that
mm,
word stood out to me when you talked about your ability to express yourself in the most vulnerable and open state. Most
mm,
potency comes from rhythm.
mm,
There are certain things, yeah, it's it's a long liner notes, but there are certain things within there
mm.
that rise above.
Okay.
So, I would say it's more prescient today than probably ever before. Easier for me to say, but hey.
Yeah. Well,
At that
here's
time, were you wearing dashikis? Were you chanting? I mean, to
yeah.
me, like this is deep, man.
Yeah, yeah, I was definitely into the so-called ethnic garb, uh, and that was that's where I felt totally comfortable at the time, and I still had really like long hair and a beard, and you know, um, one thing I wanted to mention is that talking about Julius, for example. Um, the first time I played outside of California was at the beginning of what turned out to, which was eventually that European tour in the winter of 1977. Our first gig was in Philadelphia at the Foxhole. So I and my way too much gear flew to Philadelphia, and we played 2 nights at the Foxhole as a quartet with Baikita, but with Abdul Wadud on cello.
Oh my God.
And here's the thing, aside from the fact that obviously, for me, this was like kind of unbelievable, playing with the same group that recorded Dogon AD and all those classic
Sure,
things.
sure.
But when we got there and I was setting up and, Julius was warming up, I asked him, I said, "So Julius, what are we going to play?" Because I'd never played with Abdul. And these were the two people that Julius had played with maybe more than anyone. And he just basically said, "Well, we'll just start playing and see what happens." And that's what we did. We just
Open.
improvised for,
Wow.
2 sets for 2 nights.
Oh my gosh.
And, I just thought, well, this is how it's done, and I just didn't even really think about it until way after the fact. And I realized just how deeply he trusted me to contribute to the music in an integrative and significant and appropriate way, despite the fact that I was, this 21-year-old white kid from LA. Amazing. He never said anything except, I remember I went in when we first played Dogon AD. I just played this pattern that you hear on the record, over and over, this beat, 11/8. And it wasn't until Baikita said, you don't have to play that beat through the whole thing like that. I know that's the way it is on the record. He said, but the only reason it's like that is because Philip Wilson, who was the drummer on the recording, couldn't play the 11/8 groove. And he said, I actually showed him that beat because he could just keep playing that. And that's the reason he keeps playing it, is because that's the only way he could keep the time straight.
I mean, he is, I just cannot believe you just brought up Philip Wilson because and it's just humbling to hear that that's how he figured it out because I mean with
Yeah,
him and Gene Dinwiddie with Buzzy Feet and playing in Full Moon, I mean that Butterfield Blues Band,
yeah,
really,
yeah,
oh my God.
yeah,
So anyway, and this is legendary. I did not know
yeah,
Philip Wilson was the drummer on it.
yeah. So,
Wow.
so, Baikita would occasionally say things or make suggestions or whatever, but Julius never said really anything. And, he would sometimes give these extremely broad, vague sorts of bits of observation, but nothing specific. I wanted to mention that after that tour and all of the things that happened on that, I wound up playing 2 nights up in San Francisco with a group led by Baikita. And I'm thinking of it because Baikita at that gig, every once in a while, he'd give me some specific ideas like maybe try this or, that kind of thing. But the group was Baikita, Oliver Lake, Julian Priester, and Michelle Rosewoman, and me.
Julian Priester. Oh,
Yeah.
my hero.
And I
I
have
did.
to
Oh
tell
my
you,
God.
Herbie's Mwandishi band is still to this day one of my favorite groups ever.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we saw them, Nelson, I saw them a couple of times before Herbie broke the band up. And
Hold on. I got to stop you right there because I
yeah.
know that, I mean, I've interviewed everybody in that band except Herbie and Benny Malkin. Um,
Oh yeah. I've
Julie
played with
and I
Benny.
had some great talks about, and Buster Williams too, Billy Hart about playing the London House in Chicago, which was definitely more of like an Oscar Peterson bag place,
Oh
standards. People would have a steak and then here you
yeah.
go, M1D, comes in and they start with 18 minutes worth of percussion.
Yeah.
And the waiters and waitresses were like dancing to it, but the clientele, I can't imagine the venue. You must have seen them.
Yeah, we saw them at the Lighthouse, which is a
Wow.
tiny venue, right? And
Yeah.
this is when they, and bear in mind, they traveled with their own sound guy,
They did,
Fundi,
was Dr. Gleason in the band at that time?
and Dr. Gleason was in the band. And then we
Dude, that
saw,
was a seminal stuff, man.
oh, it was out. They played the tune Quasar for an entire set.
I mean, dude, you're one of the luckiest people. I really, I mean, yeah. And anyway, continue, please.
Yeah. So, and we also saw what turned out to be one of that band's last gigs, which was at the Troubadour, and they were opening for the Pointer. No, no, they were.
No, they were, you're right. Herbie's, it's in his book. He said, dude, he goes, I can't, I gotta, he's like, I have to make more commercial music because these
Yeah,
cats are, you know,
the
nobody could
Pointer
understand
Sisters.
their music, but then the Pointer Sisters comes on. It's
The
like,
Pointer
damn.
Sisters were opening actually,
Okay. Right. Right.
and it served as kind of an industry showcase for them. This is when there were still four of them, and they were doing more of a kind of 1930s and 40s kitsch
Sure.
thing. And most of the audience was there to hear them. And so here they did their thing. The audience loves it. It's super, entertaining.
Relatable. Yeah.
And then Herbie gets up there with his group, and they played Hornets for an entire set. And Nelson and I were sitting in this table in the back with our friend then that we had at that time named Neil Parachet, listening to them. And first solo, Benny Maupin just like blows his brains out on the bass clarinet, and when he's done, no one applauds or anything.
Yeah.
It was like Deadsville.
My God.
So we're in the back, like trying to make a bunch of appreciative noise, and the whole set kind of went that way. It was just like completely lost on the audience, and it was like 2 nights later or something, because they were there for about 5 nights, 4 or 5 nights, um, that we heard that Herbie broke up the band after that. And in that sense, I mean, we were crushed and found it tragic. And at the same time, having been there when that was going down, I could see that the writing might have been on the wall.
I
But
mean, there's also a fascinating financial.
yeah,
Anyway, it was just, you know what, man? Like, hey, I have to tell you something. Of all days, I have workers outside my community where I live, jackhammering the road, and I went out and asked them if they could stop for an hour so we could do our interview.
okay,
And I was wondering, can we find a time later this week to do set two?
absolutely,
Because
sure,
we're just getting started here, man.
yeah, yeah,
And this is deep
right,
stuff. And I just want to say, man, I mean, as a journalist and as somebody who has been in the front row of sophisticated melodic music and going berserk like you and your brother and your friend were, and everybody else just right over their heads. And
wow,
it's just like, it's still like this Anglo way of passive music is made for pacification or some
uh,
kind of like
hmm,
to receive it. And the thing about you that's great is that not only are you driving, I mean, you are a pulse to the music that I love. And you've
hmm,
always tried to do your own thing too, which is
hmm,
I just don't understand how we've gotten so pacified by music in this society. But it's only gotten crazier. But at least
yeah,
you were there for the remnants. I mean, Herbie was it was probably relatively traumatic to say, my God, these Pointer Sisters. I mean, it's like George Duke told me even a couple years earlier when he was with Canon.
yeah,
Mahavishnu opened this festival
hmm,
and they blew everybody's brains away, and it was
right,
well received. And then before Cannon came on, the entire audience left. They didn't need any
wow,
more. And so it's
yeah,
like the ears. It's about ears, big ears, and big
yeah,
soul. And Alex Klein, man, I will reach out to you today. We'll get this going as soon as possible. And like I said, very humble to. I feel like
hmm.
you've been on the path for a long time, and I'm just glad
Well,
to be connected to you, man.
well, thank you. And I want to acknowledge something you said, which is I don't think Nelson and I really fully realized how fortunate we were to hear a lot of this music at the time
Sure.
until years later, because we were feeling like we missed Coltrane and we missed Eric Dolphy and all of these
Right. Right.
things. And then here it is years later, we were just kind of like, man, early weather report, Herbie, Miles, Pharaoh, McCoy
Are
Tyner,
you
all
kidding me,
these.
dude? All the original masters were still touring. There
Yeah,
was, in my mind, I mean, Dizzy was doing some of the hippest stuff I've ever heard without a drum kit. His stuff on Perception was insane. I mean, I mean, and again, Miles
yeah,
was going into that Jack Johnson bag. I mean, the whole thing was out of control.
yeah,
And yet, I know that if I was in that time too, hit like I remember Richard Davis told me in one of our interviews. He goes, "History is what's happening today."
yeah.
That's a William Faulkner line, but it's like I didn't know what he
Uh-huh.
meant at that time, but it's true because
Right.
you don't know what you're really witnessing in the moment and how it's and here I am, somebody who yes is like you and your brother, totally into sound,
Yeah.
more so than anything based on singer songwriter, and it still resonates with me today. And here we are doing a transmission that ultimately will carry through and inspire other people to seek out someone like Sonship or seek out
Yeah.
Iapetus or whatever it is. Like that's how it works. And so bless you, man. I will be in touch. All right.
All right.
All
Thank
right.
you. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah. Be cool, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye.